Welcome to the Bordeaux Show, an ongoing exploration of the famed region and its wines. I'm Ron Edwards, Master Sommelier and Director of Wine Education here at Winebow. We invite you to place any and all questions or comments into the Q&A, as we will not be managing the chat window. Let me introduce your host, Certified Bordeaux Educator TJ Griffin. TJ has held many jobs within the wine industry, from hospitality to wholesale. Throughout his career, what he enjoyed most was learning about wine and then sharing that knowledge with others. As the corporate wine educator for Winebow, he now enjoys that privilege full time. And now, here to discuss today's topic, Grave and Pessac-Léognan, TJ Griffin. Good morning, TJ.
Good morning, Ron. How are you?
I am well. Can't complain, although we may have wonderment in the background of audience if my noise canceling isn't working well, because the earth moving equipment feels like it's in my living room that's working behind our property here.
Yeah, I think your neighbor's contractors coincided. They must have contacted my neighbor's contractors, and my neighbors decided to put in a new driveway today. If you hear beeping and noise, that's what it is. I'm starting to think, Ron, that my neighbors don't really care about the Bordeaux show.
Well, we need to fix that.
Yeah.
Just put some placards in their driveway. If you gave them a bottle of Bordeaux, it might
maybe we'll bring them in as special guest presenters so they feel invested.
There you go.
So we're going to talk about Grave and Pessac-Léognan. So we were in the Médoc, and now we're just south of the city. So technically not in the Médoc, but a lot of similarities. And when we talk about the left bank appellations, the next conversation's usually about Pessac-Léognan as well. So there's a couple things to separate here. There's Grave, the appellation, there's Grave, the region. So we're going to talk about Grave, the region first, so people know where we're at. So this was where, in the medieval times, this is really the heart of where Bordeaux was, just south of the city for about 6 miles, where all the vineyards were. And it expanded, since then, but really the heart of Bordeaux production for a while. As you go further south, that's when you get into Sauternes and Barsac, which we're not going to cover today. We're going to cover that in probably the next episode. We're going to talk about just the dry whites and the red wines. So we're going to make those disappear, those other appellations. You can see the very handy color code there: red for red, light green for white wines, and then the sort of orange for the botrytis and sweet wines.
Oh, that doesn't mean that all of the classic sweet wine appellations have moved to orange wine? That's not what that means?
No, that's
I feel such relief.
That's going to be the next thing. So here we go, about 30 miles down to the south of the city, so pretty big area, as you can see. And right along the western bank of the Garonne River, and the Land forest, the pine forest, is protecting it from the ocean and the humidity, which is very important to the climate here. As you go in the northern part there, you can see Pessac-Léognan is separated out. That's where, in theory, all of the best producers are, and we'll talk a little bit about the history there of how it got separated. But Grave, the name, should be no surprise that comes from gravel, which is the predominant soil here. As you go, again, further south, you mix in some sandy limestone soils, but in general, throughout the area, you're going to see a lot of gravel. And then the Grave AOP. So AOP is just, as we, sometimes we use AOC, sometimes we use AOP. They're interchangeable. AOP, DOP, all that stuff was when they had the European Union. So you can use either, but they mean the same thing. So this was the Grave appellation, which was created in the 1930s, and it is still, in existence. But what happened was, as we'll talk about in Pessac-Léognan, they pushed to sort of go on their own, and they were successful. But this is a big area, mostly red wines. There is that subsection Grave Supérieur, which is confusing. It's not superior. It's just an appellation for sweet wines, botrytis sweet wines, just like Sauternes and Barsac. we'll cover that when we get to them. So here we go. Nice picture of Chateau, some fun facts. This area, the whole area, within, including Pessac-Léon, is really the only Bordeaux appellation that is equally prized for both white wines and red wines. And if we throw in Sauternes and Barsac, we can say sweet pottertized wines too. So it's unusual because appellations tend to focus on one or the other, even if they produce both. They're generally known for their reds or their whites, and not both. We're devoting a whole episode to classifications in the near future, so I don't want to get too into it, but interesting. I never thought about it this way, but Grave is the only appellation that was classified and now is not, because now it's Pessac-Léognan. This is thought to be the area where the ancient Romans first planted the vines. The current Grave appellation was created in 1987, even though I said earlier in the 1930s, once we split those two, it sort of started over as this new appellation. This whole area, including Pessac-Léognan, has one of the warmest macroclimates of any appellation in Bordeaux, and this is where the first harvesting usually starts. Grave is also one of the few Bordeaux appellations where the majority of the vineyards are still family owned. And this is I got to be honest, Ron, I've never heard of this wine, and I bet you have. The most expensive wine in all of Bordeaux is in Grave. It's called Liber Pater.
Well, you'd have lost that bet, because until you listed it in your notes, and I was like, well, I guess I better look that up. I had no idea. It feeds right into this concept that we brought up at the very beginning about the number of grape varieties that are actually authorized in Bordeaux and the ones they're researching for authorization that we never hear about. And apparently this is a specialty of this house after I looked it up, even though in the end, it's the really expensive wine from them appears to actually be Cabernet Sauvignon, just an ancient name. Very nice marketing ploy on their part. And it apparently works, because the 2015 went for 30,000 euros a bottle. That's like $50,000 a bottle, isn't it?
That is crazy. I don't know how I never heard of them, but I've never heard of them. But it's a very small property. It's the owner and his mule with an old plow.
Owner and his mule. That sounds like a weird movie or something. The owner and his mule. And
they supposedly, if you get to taste this amazing wine, which I hope to someday have that chance, but it's really harkening back to what Bordeaux might have tasted like in the 19th century.
Yeah, there's a good article that I read in preparation for this that I think everybody should probably look up from Decanter, which took a pretty objective view of it. I mean, nothing is ever completely objective, but they at least tried to state the facts versus the rumors. And kudos to this property plus a bunch of others that are near it that are kind of pursuing this return to pre-phylloxera vines that are being found and designated as either Massal selection of grapes we already know or actual grapes that are about to go away in Bordeaux. Any of those are pretty cool options. And while this is the most expensive of them, certainly not the only property doing this. Matter of fact, the one doing the most of it with the greatest longevity isn't the most expensive wine, but isn't that kind of the way it always works? Very interesting concept. I was intrigued. I doubt I'll ever get to taste a bottle. I think the article said they make 200 cases or something like that. It brings garagiste to a whole new level.
Yes, it does.
So anyway,
and I believe
probably enough about that. But anyway, it was fascinating. I'm glad you found that little factoid. It gave me something to look up for sure.
Yeah, it was neat. I believe one of those cases too is just held back just for the mule. So it's really 199 cases. He gets his own case.
One case for the mule. It just refuses to work without wine. That's my kind of mule right there.
The sequel to An Owner and His Mule is A Case for the Mule. That's the.
It starts to bring up was it Willie Nelson and who did that song? Whiskey for my men and beer for my horses.
So I did want to mention Château Peyrat.
Hang on just a second,
sure.
DJ. Will you spell this because we have two people, Barb and Paul, in the audience who are like, what's the name
Oh,
of
they're
this?
going to
I have
hunt
to
it
look
down
this
now.
place up. Yeah, they want to know the spelling of the wine, and Paul will answer your question. I just Googled the name of the wine, and the decanter article popped up as one of the top 5.
Yeah, it's a Latin name, Liber, Liber, Pater, Pater. Just look that up, and it's a fascinating story. And if you manage to track down a bottle and you need someone to share it with, I will travel.
Yeah, I'll even pay for my own plane ticket to come join you for the 30,000 euro bottle of wine.
I'll bring some cheese.
Yeah. All right.
So we're going to talk about, when we're talking about, the big, most well-known famous chateau in Grave, we're really going to be talking about that with Pessac-Léognan. But there's a lot of great, more affordable Bordeaux to be had in just the general Grave appellation. And this is one of them that we work with, Ron, Château Peyrat.
Yeah, I love this wine.
They make both a white and a red that are very typical of the area. It's a relatively new group that took this over, I believe, not too long ago. It's a big, big vineyard. They have a 42-acre clos, like a walled vineyard, that they work with. And I think that the white and the red are similarly priced, and they're about, depending on your market and depending on all that stuff, only about $25 to $30, and they're fantastic wines.
They are pretty closely priced, if not line priced. And I will admit I am a huge fan of the white because it has 40% Semillon in it most of the time, and I'm a huge fan of Semillon. And this wine really expresses that Grave Semillon style blend, where it has the fatness alongside of the really crisp drive of the Sauvignon Blanc, and expresses those tropical notes alongside of the tart normal Sauvignon Blanc citrus. Really lovely wine, well worth seeking out, especially for the money. If you're in the audience and you haven't tried it, definitely see what you can do to get a bottle. Last time I tried to order one, we were between vintages and it was on the water, so we may have a need to have our own warehouses restocked, but keep in mind that it's around, and the red was in stock, but the white wasn't. That was like, I don't know, 3 weeks ago. So we'll see how it goes.
So definitely check that out. But I do want to, if I can figure out, there we go. So now we're talking about the actual Pessac-Léognan AOP. So what happened was, apparently, by the, approaching towards the end of the 20th century in the 80s, this whole area had sort of like fallen off. There was just a lack of investment. Phylloxera had done its damage, and the city was really creeping through. I read, what's the stat? About in the mid-19th century, there was 5,000 hectares of vines here, and a century later, it was 500. So that's a tremendous reduction.
And that's the overall Grave appellation, though, right? There was 5,000 hectares in Grave and down to 500 in the whole, what we now see of as, well, I guess it's almost 5,000 again now, right? Because there's like 30.
It's certainly gone back up
now, plus Pessac-Léognan. It's definitely made a comeback.
Well, there's a gentleman that I think would be familiar to a lot of people that are familiar with Bordeaux, André Lerton. He had purchased some properties here in what is now Pessac-Léognan. And what happened is in 1959, there was a classification of the Chateau of Grave, and all of these classified chateaux were up here in what is now Pessac-Léognan. So he really pressed, he and some other owners pressed for having their own AOC, which the rest of Grave wasn't too happy about. But it actually worked out because once they had their own AOC, they had some political power and some financial power to fight the urban sprawl, which was really threatening to eradicate the whole area. And they fought back at that. Still a battle that goes on today, but they were able to sort of keep the city at bay and resurrect these great vineyards. And now it has its own appellation within Grave, which is just amazing dry whites and red wines. That we'll talk about.
Just to keep it in context for the audience who's thinking, how in the world could a city encroach upon one of the greatest wine regions of the world? Remember that, at that point in time, the exorbitant prices for Bordeaux hadn't happened. Burgundy was certainly more expensive at the time, and I think if you even look at some of the German white wines were actually higher priced per bottle at this point in history. If you were looking at, the top tier producers from the great vineyard sites, and Bordeaux wasn't this unbelievable luxurious wine region except for a few properties, and even those, even when you take out inflation and look at representative apples to apples dollars, the chateaus weren't getting the kind of money per bottle percentage wise against cost of living that they are now. And so it wasn't as difficult a decision to give up your winery and your vineyard land and sell it to a developer to turn into housing or whatever.
Right.
Today it would be, in some cases it would just be unconscionable, right? But if somebody offers you the right price, you're willing to take it. So it's good to keep it in context that in 1959, 1960, this was a different economic model than what we see now.
Yeah, and even if you're going through the 80s, if you remember, what was the sort of guidelines? You'd have 2 or 3 vintages a decade that were worth, drinking and saving, and you had that just didn't have the knowledge. The climate was different, so you didn't have these amazing prices.
The 80s really turned that around. It was the 70s really was the last decade that had that 2 to 3 great vintages, and then the 80s, call it great weather, call it the catch up of technology, call it the Robert Parker effect, whatever you want to deal with. But once we got to the 80s, all of Bordeaux, just based on the 82 vintage first, and then following vintages, just went through the roof. And everybody's fortunes changed, including, as we've seen, as we looked at these outlying areas, the beginnings of their fortunes changed in the 1980s too, because all of a sudden wines that people concentrated on because mere mortals could afford them and they were the great wines of the world, the attention had to shift because now it became a luxury that only very well endowed pocketbooks could reach.
Yeah, but it's a good point too about the money, because if you think about who was selling, it was really in the Médoc. Maybe Pomerol was starting to come around. Except for a handful of chateaux that we'll actually talk about in this area. Yeah, if somebody offered you the right money for your land, why not? So some fun facts. I don't know if they're fun, but they're facts about Pessac-Léognan. It's about 20% is devoted to white wine, which is these white wines are stunning. It is the only appellation outside of the Médoc to have a classified growth in the 1855 classification. Of course, that's Château Haut-Brion. And Haut-Brion, this is interesting too. Haut-Brion can lay claim to being the first Bordeaux wine to earn a professional review, which we'll talk about when we get to that slide for Château Haut-Brion. So this is from the Pessac-Léognan website. And again, as I've seen throughout doing the research for these webinars, the websites are pretty accurate reflections of the money invested in the area. There's a Grave website, which, as far as I can tell, is still not translated to English, and it's much less bells and whistles than the Pessac-Léognan website, which is this. And this, I wanted to put this in because this is what they're talking about for themselves. They're talking about the originality of the appellation. They're talking about the terroir with hills and gravel croup. Those croup that we see up in the Médoc are here. They're talking about the climate. They have the Garonne River, which softens, we've talked about maritime influence, and they have the land forest, which protects them. They have the geography, because the city will sort of sneak through vineyards, and you might have vineyards, vines facing a building. And then you might have an area where you don't feel you're at all near the city. So it's very unusual in that. And then the human dynamic as well, the workforce there. So this is what they consider to be their selling points for the appellation. So let's talk about style. And what I'm going to say about these styles is true for, I would say, olive Grave as a region for the dry wines, and even more so for Pessac. So it's just more dialed in, if you will, on these style notes, and we'll see how many people agree with these. So I'm going to do two. I'm going to do one for whites and one for reds, because the white, I think white Bordeaux in general is tremendously underappreciated. And when we talk about the great whites of Grave and Pessac-Léognan, most of the time are quite affordable in comparison to the reds. There are some exceptions, I believe. The white wine, the Pessac-Léognan Blanc from Château Haut-Brion can often be more expensive than most of the reds from the region, but for the most part, they're not. They're very affordable. But as you talked about Semillon, which is a fantastic grape, it's generally, you can have a 50-50 Semillon Sauvignon Blanc blend. You can have 100% Sauvignon Blanc. You can have small additions of Muscadel and Sauvignon Gris. And Semillon, especially as it ages, is very textured. So you have this mix of crisp and fresh with this sort of waxy richness. Not a lot, but some wines in this area are barrel fermented, which is unusual for, Sauvignon Blanc based wine, but they can handle it, and it really adds another layer of texture and complexity. And these wines are, aged for decades. Just like, there's not too many white wines in the world that you would really want to age for decades. But there's this is one of them. The complexity of not just aromas and flavors that you're getting, but the complexity of the textures and the barrel ferment. There's just so much going on here.
Yeah.
So I struggled to find an image that really represented that. But this, I came with this. It's very abstract, but I hope it communicates what I'm trying to say.
Communicates perfectly to me. I love the abstract. It's so nice of you not to go literal. I love it. And I think if you looked at the screen from your top right corner to your bottom left corner, I think that really expresses the idea you're trying to put forth. Because in Grave, you can buy, fairly straightforward 100% Sauvignon Blanc, stainless steel fermented, no barrel aging. And it tastes like Sauvignon Blanc from Europe. I mean, it's not overly rich. It's not as crisp as Sancerre, but it still tastes like Sauvignon Blanc. And then you can get into wines like Carbonieux and Haut-Brion Blanc, and that ilk down on the bottom left of the screen, where you have barrel aging, you have significant Semillon play, especially wines like Carbonieux, which is probably the most oxidative winemaking methodology of the region, and you get these really honeyed, waxy, petroleum almost aromas in the wines because of the way Semillon oxidizes with age. And it's a fascinating range. And for those out there in the audience who are working to introduce these wines to everyday people, if they like white Burgundy, they'll generally like barrel-aged Bordeaux. If they like Sancerre, they'll generally like the other end of the spectrum pretty nicely. And if you introduce it well, the other thing I think is interesting about white Bordeaux is in that middle spectrum where there might be a little new oak, but not a lot, through the oak-aged top tier, the Semillon in there gives you an extra added benefit for our New World Sauvignon Blanc consumers. The people who like, California Sauvignon Blanc really latch onto these wines when they're introduced, because they're not as tart and aggressive as New Zealand or Sancerre, but they have richness that they're familiar with from the New World, even though they don't have the extra alcohol content that you might find in Napa. So there's a lot of application for white Bordeaux. TJ, I agree with you. It's underrated. We probably shouldn't talk about it. Otherwise the prices will go up and then we can't afford it anymore. But, it is, when you talk about Bordeaux on menus, white Bordeaux used to have a lot of airplay in restaurants and on retail shelves, and it sort of slid backwards a long, long way in my lifetime. And it's time to regenerate it, because this is a style of wine that people really like. They just forgot.
Yeah, I'll say I completely agree. And the Sauvignon Blanc dominated wines, as you say, you know, if you're a fan of Loire Valley and Sancerre and Puy-Fumé, which I often sometimes I'm like, is this Sancerre? But then you get that sort of just gentle undercurrent of Semillon, because even a few percentage points will assert itself in the wine if you're paying attention. But Semillon itself is such a fascinating grape. If you think about what they do in like the Hunter Valley in Australia, when it's young, it's kind of neutral. It's fairly innocuous. It's got great acidity, but there's not so much going on. Maybe a little lemony citrus, but then it ages and it transforms. And I was reminded of this because one of the writers that was researching mentioned this. You sometimes think there's oak in a wine when there isn't, because it develops that sort of flinty, oaky, woody, toasty texture. And it's just from the grape as it ages. It's amazing. And you can certainly get that with these wines as well. And it's just a fantastic combination. Now I want one. Okay. So this is for reds, and there's a lot going on here. It's not as abstract, Ron. These are clearly horses, but they're different horses. And this is what I wanted to say about this from Grave as an entire region. You have from certain chateaux, just really good value, everyday drinking, classic Bordeaux. I was reminded when we were talking about Saint Julien, as you said, a very balanced kind of, has a little bit of everything that you're looking for Bordeaux. And I think of that as Grave as well. It has a little bit of the plushness from the Merlot. There's a lot of the chateaus, quite a bit of Merlot compared to a lot of left bank appellations. But you also have that tannic structure, that power from the cab. But you can have, I don't want to single out any one horse, but you can have like an everyday horse, or you can have, this guy in the front here, some of the best red wines in the world. And you have that all in this one region. But so that's why I wanted to show with diversity, power with elegance again, and talk about aging decades for the top wines, 10, 20, 30, 40 years, 50 years. Have you ever had some really, really old Pessac?
Really old? I don't think I've had anything past like 30 or 40 years, and I've dabbled in a couple of experiences with Haut-Brion and La Mission. I have a little bit more experience with Pape Clément, and we'll get to those anyway. But what I like about Pessac-Léognan is it has its own compact style in general. And then Grave has a much larger spectrum by comparison if you go across. And some of that is just by nature of getting out of the gravel beds and getting into sand and calcareous material. So you're going to get a lighter style wine from there. But the winemaking reflects that. So when you get out there into that sort of part where you're going to make lighter wines anyway, they tend to avoid new oak and make wines that are more fruit centric, even though they still taste like a little bit, they still taste a little earthy. But over there in Pessac-Léognan, you also have some of this sort of iron ore or iron related material in the gravel alongside of it, which if you follow through the chemistry of winemaking, the one thing that grapevines can definitely absorb prior and have as part of the metabolism of the grape and the plant prior to fermentation is actually ferrous compounds, which is really interesting because when they absorb those, the fermentation changes to absolutely adoring oxygen, and it creates a different set of compounds during fermentation because of the ability to absorb oxygen into the process. And I think that that's part of the distinctiveness of wines like Haut-Brion and La Mission Haut-Brion, where they have that sort of iron or leathery, earthy thing, and they feel just a little more round at the beginning point. Maybe that's part of it. But these wines, I love the diversity here because you can get a Grave that's really affordable and delicious, and you can get a wine that you can save for your grandchildren, all more or less in the same general area. And thankfully, Pessac-Léognan hasn't skyrocketed in prices universally, so you can see the top tier, and then mere mortals can still afford some of the wines of the second tier.
Speaking of Château Haut-Brion, so there we go. This is the wine, the only non-Médoc wine to be in the 1855 classification, because by the time that came around, this was already a very, very famous wine. And I learned some things doing research about them that I did not know. For example, they opened their own London tavern, wine tavern, where they exclusively sold their own products, so their own wine bar in London. And that was you've probably read the notes, so you know when it was, but I would not have guessed. I would have said, oh, when was that, in the 1800s? 1660s when they did that. So they were really ahead of their time as far as entrepreneurial spirit. And then Samuel Pepys sort of became known as the first wine reviewer when he reviewed Haut-Brion in 1663. And I'm going to do, not everybody will appreciate this, but this is a spot on Samuel Pepys impression that I'm about to do here.
Because you spoke to the man recently, are we going to have to talk to you about necromancing? Well, he probably he wrote his notes at the wine bar in London, right?
Yes. Friday, 10th April, 1663. Here we drank a sort of French wine called Haut-Brion, that hath a good and most particular taste that I never met with. He was that was a spot-on impression of Mr. Pepys.
And such a great description of the wine.
Well, so I've had.
What it tastes like? Just something I've never met with. Okay.
I've had Haut-Brion once, and so I can't claim to be an expert in Haut-Brion. But if you do read the experts, they're saying this is not, Haut-Brion is not necessarily Pessac, it's not Médoc, it's Haut-Brion. It is what it is. It's in a class by itself, and it's a unique wine. So I guess that makes sense what Mr. Pepys said there. Thomas Jefferson visited the chateau in 1787 and wrote about it, and noted the gravel there that was similar to the Médoc. So this was, can't go through the whole history of the transfer of property, but Clarence Dillon was the guy who got it he was a New York financier, and he got it in the middle of the Depression. And then his granddaughter married the royal family, Prince of Luxembourg, and now they run it and they own it. The style, again, I can't certainly, I'm no expert. I've never had their white wine, which I hear is just amazingly stunning. But the red, say a class by itself, compared to the other first gross, will usually be ready to drink at a younger age. They talked about purity of fruit. They talked about the complex aromatics, so you're getting earthiness, tar, leather, smoke, truffle, cassis, spice, that are all just really, I guess if you're an expert in Haut-Brion, that's what you're looking for, and that's what you will notice.
Yeah, I find the few times I've had it, I think those are accurate descriptions. There's almost I like the tar concept, because I've often thought to myself, petroleum, almost like that thing we point out in Nebbiolo from Barolo is a common thing. Just plain old rusty iron. I often have said about this wine in the 3 or 4 times I tasted it, I always talked about that sort of iron ore or blood note. And I always found the wines that the fruit had not like an overcooked, but like there was a roasted quality to the wine, that it wasn't zippy and fresh. It had this sort of secondary ripeness to it, perhaps would be a good way to put it. Not an over ripeness, but it was just, it is different. Although I think La Mission Haut-Brion and Haut-Brion are pretty similar in my experience. Yeah. And there it is, as a matter of fact.
Yeah, owned by the same folks, same family, and there's another one too. So it's almost an embarrassment of riches that this family owns here. This is much smaller production than Haut-Brion, which is already small production, but just a smaller vineyard in general. But yeah, very similar in style, just different area, different vineyards. I'm sure there's some microclimate difference here when you get down to the terroir level. And I've never had it, so I can't really speak to it.
It's delicious. Oh,
And
and by the way, the Haut-Brion Blanc, I've had it a couple of times. The one time that makes sense to talk about in the idea of ageability, it was about 10 years old, if I remember correctly, and it was still green.
it was a baby at 10.
It was a baby. It was beautiful. It was the person who served it decanted it, and I knew it was coming, so I actually was cooking dinner that night. And I cooked a dish specifically for it, which worked out really well, and helped it blossom a little bit. But it was still very young. But it was very generous of the person to share it with us. I want to say it was an 85, and we were drinking it probably in 97, 96. I think it was probably 97. So it was 10 or 11 years old.
Well, that's the thing about true wine lovers. We don't want to drink the bottle by ourselves. We want to share it with people and see how they react and share our passion for the wines and shit and see if they feel similarly. And it's very unique to do that. We're not we tend to be very generous, I guess. And I too have not. I've most of the really really expensive great wines that I've had is because someone shared them with me. So I totally agree. Speaking of food and wine pairing for these whites, these top whites that are a good bit of Semillon and maybe some barrel ferment. What do you think? That's probably not the same things that you would pair with a Sancerre or a Pouilly-Fumé. What are some of the things that you would pair with that?
Yeah, I think you got to add some texture to the plate. So that meal that I was talking about, I did pan-seared sea scallop. The big beautiful. I did a pan-seared sea scallop with a white wine butter sauce, and a whipped potato was the garnish. So we had a little bit of mix of fat and texture, and then the sweetness of the scallop. That was really good. But you can also do, white meats with those wines are really great. I think that what you're looking for whenever you put the holistic plate together is what I was approaching there. You need a little texture. If you're dealing with one of these Pessac-Léognan barrel-aged ones, especially, if it has Semillon in it, you can go a little bit broader with your flavors because the Semillon is pulling in that orange note, that riper, rounder citrus flavor. So you don't need to go too tart on your acid comparison, but you definitely need a little bit of tartness on the plate. And richer fishes. I wouldn't, if you're going to go down the path of like Grave Blanc, 100% Sauvignon Blanc, stainless steel, now you're talking about white flaky fish and shellfish and, lighter fare. But once you get into the other, if you would serve it with white Burgundy, you probably can serve it with white Bordeaux that's barrel aged. And if you think about what you're being served in Burgundy with these meals, it's everything from, salmon to pan-seared halibut with some sort of texture and earthiness like mushrooms on the plate, or going down the path of pork, or, a chicken dish that has some caramelization on the skin, like a skin-on piece of chicken that they've seared the skin really well to get that sweetness and caramelized flavor profile. Those are the kind of things you want to shoot towards when you're serving white Bordeaux, especially. And then if you're down the path of something as rich as Carbonnier, you could serve veal chops, you could serve risotto with Carbonnier. I mean, you can go. So it's really, there's a pretty big range, and it's really dependent upon house style.
Yeah, I was actually lucky enough to go to a Bordeaux tasting yesterday, where I got to taste some fantastic white wines, including Carbonnier, which is one of my faves. And it's surprising. The acidity doesn't jump out of the glass, but it's certainly there, and it's just so well integrated and interwoven with all the fruit and everything else going on there. That's just fantastic food wine.
And by the way, should anybody be wanting to splurge on Haut-Brion Blanc, thinking that they're going to serve a wine a little bit like Carbonnier, it's much fresher. They don't make it as reductive and creamy as Carbonnier style. It's a more midpoint style.
Laville Haut-Brion, again, I think we know who owns it. And this is interesting because they have a little muscadel planted on a very small 3.5 hectare parcel here. Like the chateau itself looks like it might be bigger than the vineyard, but really incredible vine density. So I didn't get into that, but when Passac formed its own AOC, they mandated some really high vine density. So this says this vineyard's planted to a vine density of 10,000 vines per hectare, on average over 50 years in age. So you can imagine what those grapes are like.
Oh, that was one of the other interesting things that's happening with this resurgence of these older vine varieties, like Liber Pater is doing. The vine density is now doubled. Liber Pater vine density is 20,000 vines per hectare.
That's insane.
And they have abandoned wire trellises, and everything is single staked, going back to the time before trellises, which were brought to Bordeaux, according to the article, in like the 1840s, 1850s. So it's very interesting that they're following that trend. And what I'm, I understand the vine density in Bordeaux, right? There's plenty of water around, and you need the vines to compete for resources. And this is a fairly generously resourced area. So it's the opposite thought process of, say, Ribera del Duero, where they're meters apart sometimes because they can't find water. So the vine density makes a lot of sense to me here. But when I read 20,000 vines per hectare, I was like, whoa, really? And then of course you wonder, all right, well, what's the kilograms per vine production when they're that dense? That would be a very interesting research project. Not that it is connected so much to the Laville Haut-Brion concept. I don't have much experience with this wine as far as something I can give you as practical feedback, but I definitely would like to have some more experience with this wine. If somebody wants to call me for a tasting, I'm happy to come by.
If you're leaving Liber Pater out of the conversation, 10,000 vines per hectare is incredibly high vine density. But Liber Pater 20,000. That's why the mule, by the way, gets a case of wine, because he earns it. He really works hard. And Château Pape Clément, which I believe you have some experience with, Ron, named after a Pope, Pope Clement. I got to have these wines yesterday, which were fantastic, and it's owned today by Bernard Magret, who was started as a negociant for the Cordier Group, very famous group in Bordeaux, and then he went off on his own. And apparently, his first purchase was not in Bordeaux; it was in Uruguay. So that's interesting. Michel Roland, of course, was a consultant here, but one of the writers I read said sometimes their use of new oak is too lavish for some, but certainly the quality of the fruit can handle plenty of new oak, and maybe you're going to want to sit on that and age it and let those oak tannins resolve. They're close to Château Haut-Brion, but they are a little bit cooler, and they actually harvest several days to a week after Haut-Brion. And they use oxen in their vineyards. And they also have, as I said, noted they produce white, and their production of white wines has tripled since Bernard Magret took over. So they certainly appreciate what they're doing for the white wines as well. And having had it very recently, I concur. They do a great job. And yeah, you have some experience with this property, right?
Yeah, I like both of these. Sorry, words are so important if you actually can use them. And there's a question from Mario. So let me try to get out what I was actually trying to say. I have experience with both the white and the red. I kept the Pape Clement red on menus on a regular basis because I felt like it was representative of the region at a price that I could sell to people without, finding someone at extreme wealth levels. And I agree. It is a fairly modern, if you want to use that word, approach to winemaking, with maybe a little bit of a parkerization approach with a little more oak maybe than I would want, but it's still very, very good wine, and the white is delicious, so well worth it. So here's Mario's question: is Liber Pater or Pater free father in Latin by Leoc Pasquet?
Loic, yeah. So, by the way, Loic is one of my favorite French male names. Loic, Loic. Yeah, Liber Pater. If you read the story, it was actually the name of another god of wine, not Bacchus and not Dionysos from the Greek, but there's some tie-in to that mythology. But it basically means like free father, right? Wouldn't it? My Latin's a little rusty, but I think that's
And my
correct.
Latin's non-existent. So you'll where's Sonia when we need her? She's not listening today. We could let her just jump right on and tell us all about it.
Well, Mario speaks Italian, so he can just tell us what it means.
Latin and Italian.
They're close.
Look at here. And Jennifer's helping everybody in the chat window. She's giving you a Wikipedia to that exact. So if you want to open up the chat window, everybody, we've free father exclamation point, says Mario Scanu. So Mario, were you just asking a question or were you telling us something? I'm confused now.
He was testing us.
Who's testing us? Just to find out that neither of us speak Latin. No problem. I could have told you that. No problem.
So there are a lot of chateaux in Pessac-la-Réunion that are worthy of mention, but we'd be here all day. But just play around with the area. Haut-Brion. I did them all at once. Sorry about that. Some of these are really fantastic for the whites. I mean, the reds are stunning, but the whites, like I just had Château Malartic La Gravière and Château Carbonieux yesterday. Those are two of my favorites, and they're sort of at the opposite ends of the spectrum, like you were talking about, Ron, as far as style, but both stunning. Do you know any of these? Well, you must know them. Do you have any personal favorites on here or that I didn't list?
No, I think this is a great starting list, and nothing immediately comes to mind that, oh, you should definitely have this. Domaine de Chevalier, their whites are more towards Carbonieux, if I remember correctly. They're more barrel-aged, oxidative style, and I like the Smith-O Lafite wines quite a bit. And wasn't too terribly long ago, I drank an Haut-Brion in a restaurant that showed really well with, it wasn't very old, but it was at least not yesterday's vintage. And no, I think this is and in this list are wines that, people who make a good living, but not an unbelievable living in America today could go out and buy these wines and enjoy them. And especially if they had some friends over, they were looking to share something great with. So that's always helpful. In our last discussion, when we talked about Saint Julien and Margaux, we talked a lot about wines that are just really hard to reach price-wise for people who make ordinary salaries. And that's not so much the case here, which is a beautiful reason to continue to explore Pessac-la-Réunion in the modern world, because, that you're getting great quality Bordeaux at yesteryear prices by comparison.
Yep. And hopefully, let's keep that to ourselves, everybody, and we'll keep it that way.
Yep. Too late. We just let the cat out of the bag.
So I always try to pass on these websites. Pessac-la-Réunion.com is quite good. It's a little bit, marketing, but it's a good resource. Vin de Grave looks like it's a good resource, but you may have to have good facility with reading French to get the most out of it. And as always, as I said last time, I cannot speak highly enough of Jeff Levy and the WineCellarInsider.com. Just a tremendous resource on all things Bordeaux. And then the Bordeaux.com website itself, which is the basis of a lot of these presentations. Check them all out. Important note here, Ron, we're going to skip the next session of the Bordeaux show would be in 2 weeks from today, but that's July 6th. And a lot of people are observing July 5th, the Monday, as the federal holiday. And that's a big vacation week, including, I believe, for one of us. So we're going to skip that, and we're just going to return in 4 weeks on July 20th. And we're going to talk about, we're going to stay in the Grave region and talk about the sweet wines of Grave Supérieur and Sauternes and Barsac and Seyron.
Awesome. I'll bring the foie gras and blue cheese.
Yes.
Sounds great. Yeah, you know, July 6th, people will still be watching fireworks in the back of their brains. So I totally understand that. But we do still have pre-shift this
Yes,
coming Tuesday before the holiday for our third pre-shift in a month. What? That's just craziness.
called a blue.
And we will be covering a kind of an extension topic of last week's topic, which, if you missed, was a great conversation with Madeline Trufant about meeting the client where they are. And then this is kind of a follow-up to that of kind of how do we as wine professionals, that when we build programs, whether retail programs or restaurant, how do we build a program that offers comfort and a chance to explore comfortably at the same time?
Yeah, I had Madeline's voice in my head as I was thinking about how to communicate about white Bordeaux and that texture, which she was really had a lot. We had a good conversation about. So if you haven't seen that, definitely check that out on YouTube, where you can find all of the episodes of the Bordeaux Show and Pre-Shift for your viewing enjoyment. And thank you, everybody, for joining us. Enjoy your time off if you're taking any in the next couple of weeks. And hopefully we'll see you here next Tuesday and come back after that for the Bordeaux Show.